It was a moment that no one expected, a moment that left the entire room silent. John Kennedy's wife Sarah sat at the lavish corner table of a high-end restaurant in downtown New York. The soft hum of conversations surrounded her, but her focus was elsewhere, on the dinner she was about to share with some of the city's most powerful and influential figures. She was used to being in the spotlight, but tonight something felt different. As she took a sip from her glass, the door swung open. A manager walked in briskly, his eyes scanning the room. His gaze locked on Sarah, and without a second thought, he made his way toward her. The room quieted as he approached, and the whispers started. The tension in the air thickened. "Ma'am," the manager said loudly, his voice cutting through the room. "I'm afraid you'll have to leave. We have a policy about certain guests." Sarah blinked, stunned, unable to fully process what had just happened. Leave? In all her years, she had never been treated like this. The people around her, some of whom she had known for years, shifted uncomfortably in their seats, casting furtive glances. "Excuse me?" Sarah finally managed, her voice shaking slightly, a mix of disbelief and growing humiliation. The manager's expression didn't soften. He glanced over her shoulder toward the other diners, as if to justify his actions, before turning back to her. "I'm sorry, but you're just not the kind of guest we want here." A gasp echoed in the room. The audacity, the sting of his words. And in front of all these people. Her face turned a shade of crimson, but her pride kept her from saying anything more. She stood up, gathering her things, trying to keep her composure. She could feel eyes burning into her. She could hear the whispers of disbelief. What had just happened? As she walked out, she could feel the weight of the insult heavy on her shoulders, the eyes of the room still fixed on her. Little did anyone know the next day would bring a surprise that no one could have predicted. The kind of surprise that would send shockwaves through everyone involved. And John Kennedy, well, let's just say no one had seen him come to the rescue quite like this before. Sarah Kennedy, the wife of John Kennedy, had always been the epitome of grace and poise. She wasn't just married to a powerful senator, she was a force in her own right. With her soft smile and sparkling eyes, she'd often been seen as the supportive wife standing by her husband in countless public appearances. But there was so much more to her. Sarah had built her own career in the arts and philanthropy, and her sense of self-worth came not from being a political spouse, but from the respect she had earned over the years. Tonight, however, it seemed as though the very world she had carefully curated was slipping through her fingers. She had always prided herself on keeping her distance from the politics of Washington, but this night, this moment, it felt personal. A manager, no one of importance really, had humiliated her without a second thought, treating her as if she was just another face in the crowd. What made this even worse was the fact that no one in the room seemed to stand up for her, not one of the high-profile guests she'd spent years befriending. They sat there, their eyes averted, unwilling to risk crossing the powerful man who had so publicly cast her aside. As Sarah walked out of the restaurant, she could feel the weight of the humiliation pressing against her chest. Every step was a reminder of the life she had chosen to lead. In that moment, she wondered, did this happen because I'm married to John Kennedy? Did his political persona, his sharp, commanding presence, overshadow everything else about her? Her mind raced as she walked down the cold street, feeling utterly alone in a city that should have felt familiar. Meanwhile, across town, John Kennedy was in the midst of a meeting with high-ranking senators. The man was a political powerhouse, known for his sharp wit, his strategic mind, and his ability to rally support when it mattered most. Standing at the podium in Washington, his speeches had often been hailed as the kind of oratory that inspired change. With his trademark tortoiseshell glasses and southern drawl, he was both a statesman and a paradox. To some, he was the epitome of Washington power, stoic, authoritative, and unshakable. But to those who knew him best, he was much more than that. John Kennedy wasn't just a senator. He was a man with a fierce loyalty to those he loved, especially his wife. He had built his empire on the foundation of integrity and respect. His career had not come without sacrifices. But one thing he had never let go of was his personal life. And in his personal life, Sarah came first. She wasn't just his partner. She was the woman who had been with him through thick and thin, who had supported him through the long nights and the grueling days of politics. To him, her happiness mattered more than any bill or speech he could deliver in Congress. But now, as he listened to the murmurs around him about the situation at the restaurant, something inside him shifted. His calm exterior cracked just slightly, and for the first time in years he felt something deep within him stir. The phone call from Sarah, her voice tinged with anger and disbelief, had shaken him in a way nothing else had before. This wasn't just a small issue. This wasn't just some politician's wife being snubbed in public. It was an attack on his family, and no one would ever make him stand by while his wife was mistreated. He set down the phone and glanced at the other men in the room. They could sense the change in him, the slight shift in his demeanor. This wasn't the usual John Kennedy they were used to. The quiet man who spent his days navigating the complexities of Capitol Hill had been replaced by someone different. Someone who was about to take matters into his own hands. As he stood up, he excused himself from the meeting and left without another word. The path was clear. He would go home, gather his thoughts, and then take action. This would not go unpunished. The manager who had humiliated his wife would soon learn just how powerful an insult like this could be when the full weight of John Kennedy's influence came crashing down. Meanwhile, Sarah, alone in her thoughts, couldn't shake the feeling of being trapped. She wondered if this moment was somehow a reflection of the world she had built around her, a world that was suddenly crumbling under the weight of a single cruel act. But deep down, she knew one thing for sure. John Kennedy didn't take these things lightly, and whatever came next, she knew he would handle it in his own unique way. The next morning, the events of the previous night still hung heavy in the air. Sarah had barely slept. The humiliation kept replaying in her mind, a vicious cycle of flashes. The cold indifference of the manager, the silent judgment from the guests, and the overwhelming sense of powerlessness that clung to her long after she left the restaurant. She'd always been in control of her world, her career, her charity work, her role as the wife of a well-known senator. But that moment had shattered her sense of security. What was the point of all the power she and John had accumulated if they couldn't protect their dignity? Her phone buzzed, pulling her from her thoughts. It was a message from John. "I'm on my way home, we'll talk." She hadn't heard his voice since the phone call, but his words filled her with a mixture of relief and dread. Relief because she knew he would make things right, but dread because she had a feeling that John wasn't going to let this go. And when John Kennedy decided to act, people took notice. At home, she paced the hallway, her mind racing. She knew John's reputation well, the quiet, calculating politician who rarely lost his temper. But she also knew his deep, unshakable love for her. In a way, this was the most dangerous part of their marriage, because when someone threatened the people he loved, he didn't just react, he struck with precision, his wrath measured but devastating. Just as Sarah stood by the window staring out at the city below, she heard the rumble of an engine, John's car. She straightened up, smoothing down her blouse, trying to calm the tightness in her chest. She had been waiting for this moment, waiting to see how he would react. She knew he wouldn't let this insult slide, but what would he do? Would he call the restaurant? Would he make an apology or demand one? She had no idea, but she was certain of one thing. John was not a man to be underestimated. John walked through the door, his presence filling the room. He looked the same, well-dressed, his tortoiseshell glasses perched on his nose, his expression calm. But there was something in his eyes, something she hadn't seen before. His usual composed demeanor had been replaced by something sharper, more determined. He had always been a protector, but today he looked like a man on a mission. "Sarah," he said softly, his voice warm yet firm, "are you okay?" She nodded, though her stomach churned. "I'm fine, John. It's hard to believe what happened." John's face hardened for a moment before he spoke again. "I'm sorry you had to go through that." You didn't deserve it. Sarah felt a wave of emotion surge through her, but she swallowed it down. She didn't want to break down now. Not in front of him. I don't know why they thought it was okay to treat me like that. John's jaw clenched, and he placed his hand gently on her shoulder. It's not about you, Sarah. It's about them. And I'll make sure they understand that. He paused, letting his words sink in. I've got a few things to handle, but I'm not going to let this stand, not for you, not for us. Her heart skipped a beat. What are you going to do? He gave her a small smile, a glint of mischief in his eyes. You'll see. Meanwhile, at the restaurant, the manager who had so casually dismissed Sarah the night before was going about his morning routine, unaware of the storm that was about to hit him. His day started like any other, ordering coffee, reviewing menus, checking in with the kitchen staff, but something in the air felt off. The usual rhythm of the restaurant was disrupted by an unusual sense of tension, the kind you only feel when something major is looming on the horizon. Then, as if on cue, his phone rang. He glanced at the screen, and his stomach dropped when he saw the name flashing on the caller ID, John Kennedy. He had heard the rumors, the ones that swirled through the city, suggesting that Kennedy was a man who could make or break careers with a single call. The manager hesitated for a moment before answering. Hello? He said, his voice forced calm. Good morning, came John's smooth, unhurried voice. This is John Kennedy. The manager straightened up, suddenly aware that this conversation was not going to be a friendly one. Mr. Kennedy, it's a pleasure to— Cut the pleasantries, John interrupted, his voice cool and cutting. Last night you had the honor of kicking my wife out of your restaurant. I hope you understand the severity of what you've done. There was a long pause on the other end of the line. The manager's mind raced, but he couldn't find his voice. I don't take these things lightly, John continued, his tone unwavering, and I don't appreciate someone disrespecting my family, especially my wife. I want you to understand something very clearly. This isn't just about one incident. This is about principle. You crossed a line. The manager's palms began to sweat as he stammered, Mr. Kennedy, I'm terribly sorry. There must have been some sort of misunderstanding. I didn't mean— I'm sure you didn't, John interrupted again. But it's too late for apologies. I'm not interested in those. The manager's pulse quickened. He could feel the weight of John's words, and it hit him with full force. He had made a grave mistake. Here's what's going to happen, John said, his voice firm. I'm going to make sure the world knows what happened here, and the world will know that disrespecting my wife in any form is something no one can get away with. Sarah, still at home, heard John's voice from across the room, calm and commanding. She couldn't help but feel a sense of reassurance. Whatever was about to unfold, she knew John would handle it, just as he always did. But this time, there was a different fire in his eyes, and she couldn't help but feel a little excitement rising in her chest. She had always loved John's quiet strength, but now, it seemed, the world was about to see just how powerful he could truly be. The phone call ended abruptly, but the weight of John's words lingered in the air. Sarah stood motionless in the living room, her heart racing, but a sense of calm was slowly settling over her. It wasn't just John's confidence in the moment that soothed her. It was the unmistakable assurance that things were going to change. Whatever John had planned, she knew it was going to be decisive and it was going to be swift. John, however, wasn't rushing into anything. He wasn't the type to act impulsively, especially when emotions were high. He paced the room for a moment, his mind working at lightning speed. The anger from the previous night was still there, but he was channeling it into something more strategic. He needed to make a point not just for Sarah, but for anyone who thought they could humiliate his family without consequence. As Sarah watched him, she could see the wheels turning in his head. He wasn't pacing out of frustration. He was calculating. The political mastermind in him was already at work. He had an uncanny ability to anticipate people's moves, to read the room before anyone else did. And right now he was reading the manager. The man didn't realize it, but he had just made the biggest mistake of his life. John wasn't going to let him off easy, not this time. Sarah, John said finally, his voice steady. "I need you to understand something. This is bigger than just this incident. This is about principle, about respect, about standing up for the people you love. You've always supported me, stood by my side through everything. Now it's my turn to stand by you." She nodded, but there was still a knot of unease in her stomach. "What are you going to do?" John's lips twitched into a slight smile. "You'll see." As the day wore on, John made a series of phone calls. He wasn't making threats, he was making connections. He called a few influential friends, people in the city who had clout in the business world and, more importantly, in the restaurant industry. He didn't need to lean on his political power for this. What he had in spades was something far more valuable: influence. The phone calls were brief but effective. Each person he spoke to understood the gravity of the situation. John didn't need to give them much detail. His reputation was enough to convey the seriousness of the matter. The word was out. The restaurant was about to feel the full force of the ripple effect of their actions. At the same time, John made sure Sarah knew that he wasn't doing this alone. He wasn't just standing up for her in the abstract. He was involving her in the process, making sure she had a voice in what came next. He didn't want her to feel powerless. He wanted her to feel empowered. It wasn't about revenge, it was about righting the wrong that had been done. Later that afternoon, as Sarah was sipping her tea in the garden, John walked up to her with a thoughtful expression on his face. "Sarah," he said, "I've decided what we're going to do." She set the cup down and looked at him, her curiosity piqued. "What's the plan?" John sat beside her, his tone measured but resolute. "We're going to let the restaurant know that actions have consequences, but we're not going to do it in the way they expect. You're not going to be the one who suffers for this." Sarah's eyes narrowed, sensing there was more to the plan than she'd heard so far. "What do you mean?" John's smile widened. "The truth is, the restaurant manager doesn't realize how deeply this runs. He's made a public mistake, but we're going to make sure the world knows what kind of person he is. We're going to make an example of him, quietly but unmistakably." Sarah blinked in surprise. She'd never seen John this calculated before. She knew he was a man of principles, but this was something else entirely. He was about to turn the tables on the very people who thought they could use their power to humiliate her. The thought both reassured and excited her. She had no doubt that whatever came next, it would be a spectacle no one would forget. John's plan was already in motion. That evening, a private meeting was set up between key figures in the restaurant industry. John, with his connections, was bringing together a group of influential individuals who could put real pressure on the establishment. He wasn't doing this with the intent to destroy the restaurant. He wanted to make sure that what had happened to Sarah would never happen again. He wanted to hold people accountable. Meanwhile, the manager of the restaurant had no idea what was coming. He had walked into his office that morning thinking everything would return to normal. But the calls started coming in, one after another. He tried to brush them off at first, but when he saw the name on the caller ID of the next call, his heart sank. It was one of the influential figures John had reached out to. The manager knew immediately that he was in deep trouble. The pressure was mounting. John was carefully orchestrating his every move, pulling the strings behind the scenes while keeping his composure in front of Sarah. He wasn't going to act hastily. He knew that patience was key. The manager's fate had already been sealed. It was just a matter of when the pieces would fall into place. But for Sarah, this wait was torturous. She knew John was doing what needed to be done, but the uncertainty of it all was weighing on her. What would the restaurant do? How would they react when they realized the full extent of the mistake they had made? And more importantly, how would this affect John and her life moving forward? Her thoughts were interrupted as she saw John walk back into the room, his demeanor unchanged. He walked over to her, sitting beside her once again. "It's all set," he said, "and now we wait." Sarah felt the weight of the moment settle over her. This was the calm before the storm, and she knew deep down that the storm would be unforgettable. The following morning, the tension in the Kennedy household was palpable. Sarah had woken up early, her mind racing as the hours ticked by. She had no idea exactly what John was doing behind the scenes, but the quiet confidence he exuded made her trust that whatever was about to unfold would be powerful. John had instructed her to stay calm and keep the day as normal as possible, despite the storm brewing just beyond their doorstep. The plan was simple. Let the restaurant's management stew for a few more hours, unaware of the consequences that were heading their way. John had orchestrated his move with precision, and now it was just a matter of waiting for everything to align. As Sarah sipped her morning coffee, her phone buzzed with a new message. It was from one of John's contacts in the business world. It's done. They're starting to feel the pressure. Her heart skipped a beat. She didn't need to know the specifics, but she knew that the first steps of John's plan were now in motion. John, meanwhile, had retreated to his study, making a few final phone calls. Each one was carefully planned, each word measured. He wasn't going to let the restaurant's management off easily. They needed to understand that disrespecting his family wasn't just a small mistake. It was a mistake that could cost them dearly. The phone call that sealed the deal came around. "No," John's voice remained calm, but there was no mistaking the force behind his words. He had spoken to the head of the restaurant chain's board. The message was simple but clear. This restaurant's reputation is about to be ruined, and it will be because of how they treated my wife. I expect you to make this right, or the consequences will be permanent. By the time the evening rolled around, the pressure was at a boiling point. The restaurant's management had already started to feel the heat from various channels, business partners, local influencers, even a few high-profile social media accounts that had picked up the story. And it wasn't just a local issue anymore. John's influence had turned it into a full-blown public spectacle. The hashtag #TryToRespectTheKennedys was trending, and local news outlets had started to pick up the story. The restaurant couldn't afford to ignore it any longer. But then came the moment that Sarah had been waiting for. The Rolls-Royce pulled up outside their home. John had arranged for it to arrive at exactly the right time. The world would soon see how he intended to handle this situation, and they would know that John Kennedy did not take threats lightly. Manager, still unaware of the whirlwind surrounding him, was sitting in his office at the restaurant, his phone buzzing incessantly. The pressure was mounting, but he couldn't quite grasp the full extent of what was happening. He thought he could ignore the situation, but the calls kept coming, each one more urgent than the last. Suddenly, the door to his office swung open. A delivery man stood in the doorway holding a large envelope. The manager's eyes narrowed as he took it from the man, noticing the name on the envelope, John Kennedy. He ripped it open with shaking hands, not sure what to expect. Inside was a single sheet of paper with bold letters. "You've made a mistake. I'll be waiting for you." It was a message, but it was more than that. It was a warning. The manager felt the hair on the back of his neck rise. He knew this wasn't something he could brush off, but what came next was far worse. A few minutes later, the restaurant's front door opened and a man in a sharp suit walked in. He was carrying a letter from the board, and his expression was grim. The manager's pulse quickened as the man approached. "Mr. Kennedy's demands have been met," the man said coldly. "The board has decided to sever ties with your restaurant, effective immediately." The words hit him like a slap. He tried to speak, to protest, but the man cut him off. "The decision has been made," he said, his tone final. "Your actions yesterday have cost you everything. The restaurant will be publicly distancing itself from you and your management. You will be the subject of a public apology, and you will be made an example of." The manager's mind reeled. His life was falling apart, all because of a decision he had made without thinking. A decision that had seemed insignificant in the moment, but had turned into a career-ending mistake. Meanwhile, back at the Kennedy house, Sarah sat with her arms crossed, her eyes fixed on the window. She could feel the air shift like a storm passing overhead. She knew the moment was coming, but there was still a sense of anticipation. She was waiting for the word that everything had changed. John entered the room, his face calm, but with a glint of satisfaction in his eyes. He didn't need to say a word. His presence was enough. He had handled it. They'll be issuing a public apology, John said softly, a smile creeping onto his face. And the restaurant's reputation will never recover from this. Sarah let out a breath she didn't realize she had been holding. There was a weight lifted from her shoulders, but also a deep sense of pride. John hadn't just defended her. He had done it with such quiet, deliberate force that the entire situation had been turned on its head. The manager had no idea who he was messing with when he thought he could disrespect Sarah Kennedy. But this wasn't just about the restaurant. This was about a principle John had always lived by: loyalty. No one would disrespect the people he loved without facing the consequences. As the evening progressed, the fallout was in full swing. Social media exploded with reactions. The news channels ran segments on the incident, and John's name was at the center of it all. His calculated move had turned the situation into a lesson for everyone who thought they could use power to bully others. And as for Sarah, she sat back, a smile slowly forming on her lips. The restaurant's apology was the final nail in the coffin. She wasn't just John Kennedy's wife anymore. She was someone who had been fiercely defended by the man she loved, and she knew that respect would never be in question again. The fallout from the previous day's events was swift, and it didn't take long for the news to spread far beyond the local restaurant scene. The apology came quickly, far quicker than anyone had anticipated. The restaurant's management issued a statement that left no room for ambiguity. They publicly denounced the manager's actions, apologized to Sarah Kennedy, and expressed deep regret for the way she had been treated. In that statement, they pledged to donate a significant sum to a charity of Sarah's choice as a gesture of goodwill. The apology seemed sincere, but it was clear this was a calculated move to salvage whatever they could of their reputation. While the apology was a step in the right direction, it was hardly enough to undo the damage that had been done, not just to Sarah, but to the restaurant's long-term image. The media coverage that followed was intense, with reporters tracking down customers who had witnessed the incident. Everyone had an opinion on the public shaming, but the consensus was clear. The restaurant had lost far more than just one customer. It had lost respect, and the world had seen how easily it could happen. As for Sarah, she felt a sense of bittersweet satisfaction. The insult that had been directed at her had been turned into something much more significant than she had ever imagined. She hadn't asked for any of this, and part of her still wished the whole thing could have been avoided. But the way John had handled the situation had left her in awe. He had turned what could have been a simple act of revenge into a masterclass in protecting one's family with grace and power. Sarah knew her husband well, but this was a side of him that few ever saw. His ability to control a situation, to manipulate events without raising his voice, was a quiet but potent force. It was a lesson in dignity, but for John, the situation was far from over. He wasn't one to bask in victory for long, especially when there were still unresolved matters. The restaurant's public apology was only a part of the equation. What mattered now was ensuring that this never happened again. Not just for Sarah, but for anyone who dared to challenge his family's integrity. He had made a point, and as far as he was concerned, the matter was closed. But there was still one final step. The next day, John woke early, as he always did, before the sun had fully risen. He moved through the house quietly, his thoughts focused, his mind sharp. Sarah was still asleep, the events of the last few days having taken their toll on her. She had finally managed to relax, her anxiety dissipating, but John knew better than anyone that it would take some time before the weight of the humiliation fully lifted from her shoulders. As he prepared for the day, his phone buzzed. It was a message from one of his business partners, a lawyer who had been following the developments. "The restaurant board is scrambling. They're offering you a meeting today. They're looking for a way to make things right beyond just the apology. They want to negotiate." John didn't hesitate. He had already made up his mind. He wasn't interested in negotiating for the sake of making amends or receiving more public apologies. The damage was done, and his message had been sent. But there was something else he wanted. Later that morning, he arrived at the restaurant, dressed in a sharp suit. The manager from the previous day was no longer in charge. John had made sure of that. The new leadership was more cautious, more aware of the power dynamics at play. When John entered the conference room, there was an air of forced politeness that hung thick in the room. The board members greeted him, but their faces betrayed their nervousness. They knew this was a conversation they had to get right. But John wasn't here for pleasantries. He got straight to the point. "I'm not here to drag this out," John began, his voice firm but measured. "The apology you've issued was a start, but it's not enough. You need to demonstrate that you understand the severity of the mistake you made. Not just to me, but to anyone who might be watching. It's about accountability." One of the board members cleared his throat, trying to maintain composure. "Mr. Kennedy, we understand that, and we want to make it right. We're open to suggestions. What can we do to rebuild trust with you and your wife?" John leaned back in his chair, his fingers steepled together. He wasn't angry anymore. There was no need. This was all about ensuring they learned the lesson he was teaching. "First," John said slowly, "you're going to contribute to a new foundation, a charity focused on empowering women in business. You'll be a major donor, and you'll ensure that women like Sarah, who face this kind of disrespect, have the resources to rise above it. You'll fund mentorship programs, scholarships, something that lasts." The room fell silent. They hadn't expected this. They had thought they would be making a few token donations to avoid bad press. But this was different. This was a commitment. This was about making real, lasting change. "Second," John continued, "I want a public acknowledgement of Sarah's role in shaping the direction of the charity. You'll put her name on it. This isn't just about making amends to me. It's about recognizing the value and worth of the people you've wronged." He paused for a moment, letting his words sink in. "I don't need a public apology anymore. What I need is for you to change how you do business, to change how you treat the people who walk through your door. This is your opportunity to prove that you're capable of more than just serving food." There was a murmur around the table, but no one interrupted. They were all aware that John wasn't asking. They were being told. Later that evening, as John returned home, Sarah was waiting for him. She had heard about the meeting, of course. She knew how John worked. But when he walked in, his expression was calm, with just a hint of satisfaction. "Is it done?" she asked, her voice steady but curious. John gave her a small smile. "It's done. The restaurant's going to fund a charity for women in business, and your name's going to be on it. I made sure of that." Sarah's eyes widened. She hadn't expected that. John, you didn't have to do all that." "I know," he replied. "But it's not about what I had to do. It's about what needed to be done. No one gets to treat my family that way." Sarah smiled, a quiet but powerful smile that conveyed both gratitude and pride. She had never been more sure of her love for him, nor more certain that the respect she had lost was being restored by his strength, his strategy, and most of all, his unwavering loyalty. The days that followed were filled with an almost surreal calm. The restaurant's public apology had been aired, and the new charity founded in Sarah's name was quickly gaining traction. News outlets that had once focused on the drama now shifted their attention to the positive change emerging from it. The hashtag #RespectTheKennedys continued to trend for days, and many businesses, both local and national, reached out to support the foundation. Sarah, who had once been publicly humiliated, now found herself the subject of admiration and respect. People had seen the depths of her strength and John's unwavering support, and in return they offered their help, their respect, and their praise. But despite all the accolades and public attention, John remained steadfastly humble. He wasn't one for basking in the limelight. He had done what he believed was right, and that was enough for him. However, for Sarah, it was a different experience. She had always known that John had a powerful presence, both publicly and privately, but this felt different. This wasn't just about his influence or his career. It was about how much he cared for her, how far he was willing to go to protect her, even when the stakes were high. It wasn't just a political move, it was personal. In the days following, the fallout Sarah had begun to reflect on how much John had truly changed the trajectory of her life, not just with his actions, but with his understanding. For the first time in a long time, she felt truly seen. It wasn't just the apology, or the money donated, or even the media buzz that meant the most. It was that John had stepped in, not as a senator or a powerful figure, but as a husband, as her partner, with his full support and determination. He didn't care about winning a political battle, he cared about her. On a quiet evening, as they sat together on the porch of their home, Sarah leaned her head on John's shoulder. The air was warm with the faint scent of jasmine, and the hum of crickets filled the space between them. For the first time in weeks, she felt completely at peace. The storm had passed, and what was left in its wake was something far more valuable: clarity, love, and strength. "You know, I've been thinking," Sarah began, breaking the comfortable silence. "All of this, what you did for me, none of it was easy. But I think it's made me realize something." John turned to her, his brow furrowing slightly in curiosity. "What's that?" She smiled, her eyes soft with emotion. "It's not about being perfect or winning every fight. It's about standing together when things get tough. You didn't just stand up for me. You made sure that everything we went through meant something, that it didn't just end with an apology or a donation. You made sure there was something lasting." John smiled, a small, knowing smile. "I didn't do it for the recognition, Sarah. You know that." "I know," she replied, "but that doesn't change how much it means to me, and to everyone else who's been inspired by what happened." The words hung in the air between them, quiet and true. What had started as an act of humiliation had become a catalyst for something far greater, a movement. The foundation they had created in the wake of the incident was already making an impact. Women from all over the country were reaching out for mentorship, scholarships, and opportunities that had once seemed out of reach. And it all started with John's unflinching resolve to protect her, his loyalty, his love. It wasn't just a gesture. It was the foundation upon which everything else was built. That evening, as they sat together on the porch, John received a call from one of the foundation's new partners. Sarah listened quietly as he discussed future initiatives, his voice calm but passionate. The impact they were having was already spreading, and the future of the foundation seemed incredibly bright. When he hung up, he turned to Sarah. "It's happening," he said simply, a spark in his eye. "It's really happening." Sarah nodded, her heart swelling with pride. "We're really doing this, aren't we?" "We are," John replied, "and it's only just beginning." The next morning, as Sarah scrolled through her emails, she found a message from one of her longtime friends, a fellow philanthropist who had been following the situation from the start. The email read, "Sarah, I just wanted to tell you how much your courage has inspired me. It's rare to see someone stand up for themselves in the way you did, and even rarer to see someone like John handle a situation with such integrity. What you're doing together is more than just charity, it's a legacy." Sarah paused for a moment, the words sinking in. She wasn't just involved in something temporary. She and John had created something that would last, a legacy that would stand as a testament to their love, their resilience, and their commitment to making a difference. As the weeks passed, the foundation's work grew, and so did the respect surrounding both John and Sarah. But it wasn't just the world that had changed. Sarah had changed too. The woman who had once felt humiliated and small was now standing tall, her head held high, knowing that she had the strength to face whatever challenges came her way. And with John by her side, she knew that no matter what, they would continue to face it all, together. Friends, if you enjoyed this story, don't forget to like the video and subscribe to our channel for more inspiring stories. Also, hit the bell icon so you get notified about every new video. And remember, true change always begins with a single step, and that step could be yours. Be sure to share your thoughts in the comments. We can't wait to hear from you.